I can see him coming up through the door.
The Alfred was a surprise. I didn't know they had named.
I'd say just keep going.
Yeah. Okay, I'd like to call the Wilton Board of Education meeting to order on November 10th, 2011. The first item that we have on the agenda is to review and approve the agenda. This is a revised agenda. We've added the revised calendar adjustment. Could I have a motion to approve the revised agenda?
So moved.
Second?
Second?
All in favor?
Aye.
We now have time for the public to come forth and speak to the Board of Ed if you'd like, either about the agenda or about other items that may be of interest. Seeing none, then we will move on to the consent agenda. Could I have a motion to approve the consent agenda this evening? Second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
We'll now move on to reports and recognition, and the board chair has a brief report this evening. I just wanted to address the public again to review the fall schedule of board activities, which provide the crucial information for building blocks for next year's school budget. This has been a particularly difficult start to the school year, and I appreciate the patience of the community and the parents as we work through the previously scheduled school and community events.
Sorry, I'm late.
That's all right. We also want our children to get back to a regular schedule. We certainly sympathize with that. Again, tonight we will view and discuss the revised calendar again. This is one year in which this topic just will not go away. We will also have the opportunity to review and discuss the testing report following a presentation by Mrs. Driver and Mr. Canty. I do want everyone to be aware that these presentations and reports are available on the Wilton Public Schools website. Just to quickly review they will be available on the website within a week to 2 weeks. Just to review the activities that we've had to date and where we'll be going for the rest of this year. On the 27th, at our last meeting, the board approved the budget assumptions for the year, and I'd add that these assumptions closely track the strategic plan. That evening, we also heard from Mrs. Essman on the enrollment projections. Tonight, as I mentioned, we'll be discussing the testing report. Then the following meeting on November 22nd, and I'd add that is a Tuesday, that's Thanksgiving week, we'll be looking at the class size report. Then on December 8th, following the organizational meeting, we'll be looking at the technology plan and the facilities report. Then finally on December 15th, we'll have the first cut at the recommendations for the budget from the superintendent. I'd emphasize that each report, which is presented to the board in the fall, is the result of countless hours of thought, analysis, and preparation by the administration, staff, and volunteers that do get involved. And for this, we are very much appreciative of the time and effort that everyone puts into this. Dr. Richards.
Good evening. 2 items tonight. Excuse me. The first has to do with our Veterans Day programs, and as you know, Wilton has a rich history of using the Veterans Day as a way of helping our students further their understanding of the importance of service to our country and the contributions that many have made over the centuries of our history. The following is just a very quick summary of what will take place tomorrow in each of the schools. At Miller Driscoll, for our younger students, it's a program that includes some patriotic songs. They have a guest speaker coming, and they conclude with a song, United We Stand, which is something that I guess they've been working on since they united as a school. At Cider Mill, we'll again host veterans in our local and from our local and surrounding communities. We have about 100 veterans in attendance at this program. Our guest speaker this year is Captain Brandon James, who's a nephew of one of our staff members, Carla Palmer. He's a graduate of West Point, served in Iraq, and is currently enrolled in MIT in pursuit of a degree in civil engineering. At Cider Mill, we will be some of our local and national representatives, Senator Boucher, Representative Lavelle, and U.S. Congressman Jim Hines will be attending one of the assemblies. This year, classes piloted at each grade level piloted some lessons with some pre-teaching points going into the assembly. The grade 5 classes will contribute to the assembly. They recite In Flanders Field, which, as you know, is a very powerful piece of writing by a lieutenant colonel from World War I. The goal at Cider Mill is to have all students, as many students as possible, all grades, contributing to the assembly. The piloted lessons include the following briefly. Just in 5th grade, I mentioned the Flanders Field. Students learned about the history of the poem, the origins, and the history of the United States cemetery in Belgium, which is a very important place in the map. Students examined the primary source photo of Lieutenant Cray's poem from the Library of Congress and compared it with today's current translation and use. So they really made a close reading of the text out of it and utilized video resources and other resources to study this issue. 4th grade students examined the War of 1812, which inspired the poem by Francis Scott Key, which, as you know, became the Star-Spangled Banner. And students did some exploration of Fort McHenry and analyzed the original flag using the National Museum of American History's interactive guide. So they utilized technology to study a little history. At 3rd grade, E. Bunting's The Wall is a beautiful picture book inspired by the Vietnam Memorial. In Washington, 3rd graders read this story, participated in class discussions, commenting on the memorial. And the tie-in, of course, at Cider Mill is between the wall of stars, or the Vietnam Wall, and the wall of stars that's displayed in the main hallway at Cider Mill. The learning will continue throughout the day as staff and students take part in these activities. After the assembly, some of the veterans will be coming back to classrooms for Q&A with the students. There will be writing letters to veterans that will be sent overseas to VA hospitals, and utilizing some other age-appropriate videos concerning the contributions of veterans and the challenges that the families face. So with these initiatives, I think Cider Mill has really tried to work closely with the K-12 teams to ultimately create a program that will build from level to level, including at the high school. At Middlebrook School, members of the Middlebrook community are going to honor local veterans with an assembly. There are actually several of them now because of the size of the school. During this assembly, students are going to introduce the honored guest, read traditional and original poems, perform a variety of musical selections, present original essays on what Veterans Day means to me, and offer an original video tribute. This is really, this was compacted a little bit, and I know Mrs. Harris and her real desire, as all the principals wanted to be just right. I think we didn't have as much rehearsal time, but knowing Middlebrook, I'm sure they will pull it off in a spectacular way. At the high school, the day begins with a message from Bob O'Donnell, principal, followed by a moment of silence on the pledge. There will be discussions and readings in social studies and English classrooms. Arrangements have been made for a flag and uniform display in the lobby. There'll be LCD monitors displaying a commemorative message for veterans, including the recognition of Wilton High staff members who are veterans. There's been a campaign to send notes of appreciation to the American Legion veterans and the VA hospital. There's been an ongoing campaign, the Socks for Soldiers, and display of books here in the library. And again, some of our musicians will participate in the Veterans Day Parade. So all in all, I think it's really a very nice, comprehensive program in our schools. And I think the veterans recognize that we are in school this day, but we are also using it to help our students appreciate the true meaning of the day. So that's we really appreciate all the work principals have done getting all this ready. The second item, yesterday we had, Tuesday, our professional development day. It featured approximately 31 workshops for our teachers, administrators, and a special effort. I know Ann and Ellen made an effort to make sure that there were workshops for some of our paraprofessionals to help advance their learning, professional learning. There were strands that we organized the day around, And I will give you a complete listing. I don't have a clean copy, but I'll send you a clean copy of all the different workshops. But the strands were curriculum instruction, school culture and diversity, special education, technology. You can see all of these really relate to our strategic plan. Some of the workshops I went to one that was entitled Launching Self-Directed Learners with Habits of Mind. Bennett Kallick, who's an internationally renowned educator, worked with two different groups, with the K-5 group and then the 6-12 group, really furthering the teacher's understanding of habits of mind, and which are the dispositions that we try to inculcate in kids so that to help them become persistent, persevering, thoughtful inquirers. There was a workshop on managing a reading workshop to maximize its effectiveness. As you know, the reading, writing workshop program, that's an important part of our instructional core. There were workshops on phonetic awareness and auditory processing. There was a workshop on cyberbullying. Tom Mooney did a workshop on the uses of social networking and some of the important pitfalls to consider about the use of social networks. There was a workshop, Anne had organized one on apps for children with special needs. As you know, you will hear more about this. The technology, particularly the iPad, they're developing all sorts of apps that have really been incredibly powerful for our youngsters, particularly some of whom have the communication disorders like autism spectrum disorder. There were workshops for our PE on the fitnessgram, which is a way of kids setting individual goals in physical fitness and health. There were a myriad of technology workshops on smart boards, educational uses for Google tools, and so on. So again, in closing, we appreciate the work and coordination, planning and coordination that went into making this day really useful and productive.
Thank you very much, Dr. Richard. We'll have committee reports. I think I would have had the technology report if we had electricity. So Matt's not here for that. So we'll now move on to the district reports. There you go.
Good evening. One of the great pleasures of my new position as assistant superintendent has been the opportunity to work with a wonderful cadre of staff members in the department. And certainly I'm blessed to work with Mrs. Lynn Driver, who is the district's testing coordinator. She's also the disseminator of packets to the Board of Education with our
don't trip.
presentation. So certainly my congratulations and well wishes to Lynn for all of your hard work. I also want to acknowledge the tremendous amount of time and effort that goes into this work from our building administrators. Our principals are certainly in the limelight and get a lot of the credit for the success of our schools, but in many ways it's the assistant principals who are out there doing a lot of the groundwork. And tonight we have, of course, Catherine O'Keefe and Rich Sanzo and Maria Coleman here. I'd like to acknowledge the work of our district data team members, Leslie Pearson at Miller Driscoll, and Tom Ford at Cider Mill, Kevin Welch at Middlebrook. Of course, Maria serves in that capacity at the high school. This group works very hard on taking a good, hard look at our assessment data. And then that entire group works closely with our instructional leadership team to administer our wide range of assessments, and then, of course, to engage in the important work of analyzing our results. So, here we go. I think it's important in setting the stage for our conversation tonight to bring some context to the work. Certainly, the board has received the testing report, which is a far-ranging summary of the various assessments that our students take across their years here in the district. But it's just one piece of the work that goes on to engage in the important work of gauging how well our students are indeed responding to the learning opportunities that they have in front of them. So the standardized testing piece, which we'll report on tonight, is just one piece of the puzzle. We're also looking at unit tests, classwork, teacher observations, and homework. In fact, I had the opportunity yesterday to observe a first grade classroom. The students were involved in a writing workshop opportunity, and it was quite interesting to me to watch that teacher navigate the classroom. There was a great deal of assessment taking place during that 30-minute block that was quite informal, but in many ways just as diagnostic, just as prescriptive, and just as necessary as the information we're going to discuss with you tonight. The standardized test results, we understand they're important. They're important as a measure of student learning to our teachers and our community. They do provide us with a yardstick to gauge the success of our students and indeed make comparisons. Fundamentally, we're engaged in the effort to try to identify through this data a student's strength areas and growth areas. We're mindful of the importance of reporting that progress, not only internally within our district, but to the constituencies, most notably our parents. Fundamentally, the purpose of the work is to identify those students who are in need of extra help, remediation of their skills, and then to help inform our practice, to make decisions around instruction, curriculum, and assessment. So, that work I did yesterday in that first grade classroom was one moment in time in the lives of these somewhat smaller students that I'm used to working with. But in the same way, these standardized tests just take a snapshot in time of a child's performance at that given moment. They sit for these important exams, and I think it's really important to understand that it's just one aspect of the entire work that goes on in the school district over the course of the year. So you don't get into that sense of day-to-day performance. You also, I was asked often as high school principal to respond to the outstanding performance of our students on measures like the SAT or the AP exams. I was always quick to acknowledge the work of our K-8 schools in helping to prepare our students, but I was also quick to make it very clear to the media that this is just one aspect of how we measure success in our school district. We look very closely at students and how they perform in the arts, on the athletic field, in a wide range of leadership opportunities, etc., as a way to gauge success across our program. So tonight we're going to report on the Connecticut Matric test, which is administered to students in grades 3 through 8. The Connecticut Academic Performance Test, administered to students in grade 10. At the high school, we'll review our SAT performance, our AP exam performance, take a look at the end game of all this work, which is to report out on college attendance. So at this point, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mrs. Driver. She'll be reporting on the grades 3 through 8 results on the Connecticut Mastery Test.
Good evening. The CMT is an assessment to see how well students statewide are reaching the standards of achievement established by the State Board of Education. It's been in existence since 1985. We're currently in the 4th generation of the test. It's given every March to students, and 2011 was the 6th administration of this generation. All students in grades 3 through 8 take tests in math, reading, and writing. And students in grades 5 and 8 also take a science test. Students are tested in one of 3 ways. Most students, including most special education students, take the standard CMT. There are also 2 alternate assessments for students with significant disabilities or cognitive impairments, but this is only a very small number, less than 10 at each grade level that would take those. Results are received electronically in mid-July, and parent and school paper reports are received in late August, and those are sent home to families in early September. Results are reported at 5 levels: Level 1, below basic; Level 2, basic; Level 3, proficient; Level 4, gold; and level 5 advanced. There are two different performance standards for reporting results, and the first is commonly referred to as GOLD. Students who score at level 4 or level 5 meet the state and district goal for mastery and are also considered to have achieved end of grade level mastery. The second is referred to as proficient, and this is the NCLB, or No Child Left Behind, accountability piece, where students are scoring at levels 3, 4, and 5. Now, there are benchmarks in math, reading, and writing. In 2011, the math benchmark was that schools and districts had to have 91% or more of their students scoring at or above the proficient level. Now, this increased significantly from the prior 3 years, where the benchmark was 82%. In reading, in 2011, the benchmark was 89% of students had to score at or above proficient, which increased from 79% the prior 3 years. And in writing, the benchmark is 70% of a school or district students must score at or above the basic level, which is a pretty low standard compared to math and reading. Now, as I just said, there are two different CMT performance standards, the state and district target, which are levels 4 and 5, which is a higher performance standard, and the federal target, levels 3, 4, and 5, where the bar is a little lower. So first tonight, we're going to take a look at the results in terms of the state and district target for student performance. Here are the 2011 CMT results for our students. That is the percent of students who scored at levels 4 or 5. Now, what type of mastery do we want to see? Ideally, we want to see mastery at or above 80%, and the higher into the 80s, the better. In recent years, we've also targeted 90% or higher as our goal for mastery. Now, for the most part, these are excellent percentages. You'll notice that in math, in grades 4 through 8, mastery was above 90%. In reading, in grade 3, mastery was at 85%, and in grades 4 through 8, we were above 89%. In writing, we're mostly in the mid to upper 80s, with the exception of grade 3 and grade 7. And in science, we were above 89%. Now here's an analysis of the mathematics results. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 3 was 78%. The percent of students achieving mastery in grades 4 through 8 was above 90%, which is commendable. Now it helps to also look at averages over time and not just scores in one particular year. So the 3-year average for mastery in grade 3 is 82%. That was brought down by the 78% this year. Grade 3, the prior 2 years, had been in the mid-80s. And across our demographic reference group, the other schools that we compare ourselves to, grade 3 scores pretty consistently in the 80s in math. The 3-year average for mastery in grades 4 through 8 is above 90%, which is excellent. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 3 decreased by 7 points in 2011 compared to 2010. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 4 increased in 2011 compared to 2010. The percent of students achieving mastery in grades 5 and 6 stayed about the same in 2011 compared to 2010, but these percentages were well above 90% in both grades. And the percent of students achieving mastery in grades 7 and 8 decreased in 2011 compared to 2010, but the percentages were still above 90% in both grades. There are between 18 and 23 content strands that are assessed at each grade level on the mathematics CMT. We consistently do very well in the majority of them, estimating solution to problems, approximating measures, customary metric measures, and mathematical applications, which are the word problems, story problem solving, are generally often below 82%. So that's an area we continue to work on across the 6th grade levels. An analysis of the reading results. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 3 was 85%. The percent of students achieving mastery in grades 4 through 8 was above 89%. The 3-year average for mastery in grades 3 through 5 is above 85%. I'd like to see that. The 3-year average for mastery in grades 6 through 8 is above 93%. That's outstanding. Grades 4, 5, and 7 had an increase in the percent of students achieving mastery in 2011 compared to 2010. Grade 6 stayed about the same. Grades 3 and 8 had a decrease in the percent of students achieving mastery in 2011 compared to 2010, but grade 8 was still above 90% both years. Now, the average DRP unit score, which is one of the components to the reading test, was well above goal for all grades. This is terrific, what we want to see. And the reading comprehension content strands, there are 4 of them: forming a general understanding, developing interpretation, and examining the content and structure, were all above 90% mastery across all grade levels. The 3rd strand, making reader-text connections, is a very challenging component, and we were below 82% mastery in grades 3, 4, 6, and 7. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 3 was 77%, below our target of 80. But across the DRGA, grade 3 is in the 70s and low to mid-80s pretty consistently. We were in the mid-80s in grade 3 the prior 2 years. In 2011, 4 of the 8 schools in our reference group scored in the 70s. In 2010, 3 of the schools in our reference group scored in the 70s and 1 scored in the 60s. And in 2009, 2 of our reference group schools were in the 70s. So this is definitely a tougher area for those younger students. The 3-year average for mastery in all grades is between 82 and 89%. The percent of students achieving mastery in grades 4 and 6 increased in 2011 compared to 2010. The percent of students achieving mastery in grades 3, 5, 7, and 8 decreased. The average direct assessment of writing, that's where the students write in response to a prompt. The score was above the district goal at all grade levels, so we were very pleased with that. And the 2 content strands on the editing and revising test, the composing and revising strand was below 82% in grades 3, 4, 6, and 7, and the editing strand was below 82% in grades 5 and 8. Those are 2 areas we continue to work on consistently across the grades. Here's an analysis of the science results. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 5 was 90%. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 8 was 91%. The percent of students achieving mastery in grade 5 stayed about the same between 2011 as compared to 2010. And the percent of students achieving mastery in grade 8 decreased slightly in 2011 compared to 2010, but mastery was still above 90% both years. That's outstanding. The 3-year average for mastery on science in grade 5 is 88%, and the 3-year average for mastery in grade 8 is 91%. Now, this is only the 4th year that a science test has been part of the CMT. And mastery in both grade 5 and grade 8 has trended up from the mid and upper 80s now to the low 90s. Now, how do we compare to other schools? Wilton students continue to perform well above state averages by 15 to 30 percentage points across all grades and subjects. Not just this year, but historically, that's true. As a district, we compare favorably to the other schools in our demographic reference group. A demographic reference group is comprised of other schools similar to ours, other high-performing school systems like us. Our demographic reference group is DRG A, and the other districts in this group are Weston, Westport, New Canaan, Darien, Ridgefield, Easton, and Reading. So here's how we compare to the other districts in math. We are well above state averages at all grade levels. And when we compare ourselves to our reference group schools, ideally we want to be at or above the DRG average. So you can see that we are above the DRG average in grade 5, about the same in grades 4, 6, and 7, a little below in grade 8, but I want to point out that in those grades our mass rate is still above 90%. And we're below by 7 points, 7.6 points in grade 3. Here's how we compare to other districts in reading. We're above the DRG average in grades 3, 4, 5, and 7, and about the same as the DRG average in grade 6. Below in grade 8, but we're still above 90%. And again, we're well above state averages at all grade levels. Here's how we compare to other districts in writing. We're above in grade 4, above the DRG average. We're a little below in grade 5 and 8 by about 2 points. And we're below in grades 3 and 7 by about 5 points. In science, we're above the DRG average in both grades. This is an area where we consistently perform at very high levels. Now we're going to look at the results in terms of the federal standards for student performance, which are levels 3, 4, and 5. Federal standards for performance came about as a result of the No Child Left Behind federal legislation. And I just want to take a moment to give you a little background on this. On January 8, 2002, President Bush signed into law the No Child Left Behind Act, which asked America's schools to describe their success in terms of what each child accomplishes. States were mandated to create their own standards for what a child should know and learn. And remember that, creating their own standards, because we'll talk about that probably during questions about where testing is going down the road. With standards in place, states must test every student's progress towards those standards by using tests that are aligned with the standards. And each state, school district, and school is expected to make adequate yearly progress towards meeting the state standards or be held accountable. So what is adequate yearly progress? Adequate yearly progress, often referred to as AYP, under the No Child Left Behind legislation, requires schools and districts to meet benchmarks in 3 areas. First, in participation, where you must have a minimum of 95% of your students that are tested, either by the standard, the MOS, or the skills checklist. Wilton consistently, throughout the years, tests 100% or very, very close to that. There's an accountability requirement where a certain percentage of students must score at or above proficient level 3. We talked about that a minute ago. In 2011, the benchmarks for accountability increased to 91% in math and 89% in reading. Then there's an additional academic indicator where elementary and middle schools must also have 70% or more of their students score at or above the basic level 2 in writing. Now, when we talk about accountability and students, 91 or 89% of the students having to score at or above proficient, this is true for the entire group of students in each grade level in school, as well as all subgroups. The subgroups are those groups of students that have historically underperformed. The state identifies special education students, racial and ethnic groups, economically disadvantaged students, and English language learners as subgroups. And really, in Wilton, the only subgroup large enough for reporting is special education. Now let's look at how Wilton students performed in relation to the required benchmarks. Here is the percent of students achieving NCLB proficiency in each grade and subject. We're consistently in the mid to upper 90s year after year. Now the red bars were the benchmarks of 82% in math and 79% in reading in the years 2008 through 2010. So if this was last year, we would say we had scored well above the benchmarks in all grades and subjects. Now the black bars are the increased benchmarks of 89% and 91%. And as you can see, we're still above the required benchmarks, but that gap is closing. Now, in order to make adequate yearly progress, schools must meet the target percentage of students at or above proficient for the whole group and all subgroups. And as you can see, both Cider Mill and Middlebrook achieved adequate yearly progress in math in 2011. Now, many schools and districts, as you can imagine, are beginning to fail to meet the federal No Child Left Behind standards of adequate yearly progress. This is due in large part to the significant increase in the benchmarks, where 9 in 10 students are now required to be proficient in math and reading. Let me share with you some statistics. 373 out of 786 elementary and middle schools, that's 48% of elementary and middle schools, did not make adequate yearly progress in 2011, compared with 2010, which was only 27% not making AYP. At the high school level, 45% of high schools did not make AYP in 2011, compared to 31% in 2010. At the district level, 29% did not make AYP in 2011, compared with 19% of districts in 2010. So because more schools and districts are now failing to meet the federal No Child Left Behind standards of adequate yearly progress, there is an alternative calculation called Safe Harbor that enables schools to achieve adequate yearly progress by reducing the percent of students who are not proficient by 10% from one year to the next. So you're not penalized if you consistently make reductions in the number of students that are not hitting that proficient benchmark. A total of 161 schools and 33 districts achieved AYP through Safe Harbor in 2011, and Wilton was one of those. As you can see in reading, Middlebrook achieved the standards for the total group, their special ed subgroup, the participation requirements, and therefore as a school, outright. Whereas Cider Mill achieved it outright for their total group and their participation requirement. But their special ed subgroup didn't hit that 91% benchmark, but they did achieve AYP through the Safe Harbor calculation. So we are still considered to have made adequate yearly progress through Safe Harbor in reading.
Could you go back to 22 for a second?
I'm sorry?
Could you go back to the previous slides? I have a question. Where the check mark says total group,
Mm-hmm.
Could we get a feel, could the board get a feel what percentage that is of the population?
Well, the total group in this case refers to the number of students in the building. So it's a little over 1,000 in each of our buildings. So 9 and 10 of those students have to make that 91% proficient benchmark.
You need to go back one slide. Go back to your slide that had the lines.
No, I'm good. I think you answered my question.
So in this case, you can see the total as it relates to the benchmark. If that helps.
It's never a problem for our district to meet those benchmarks for the whole group of students. Where it becomes an issue sometimes is within the special ed subgroup. If you figure at each grade level, there's somewhere between 30 and 40 special education students. That means that if you have 36 or 37 students out of 40 that are making it proficient, you still haven't met the benchmark because 3 or 4 didn't.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's how it affects it. Now, in writing, Cider Mill and Middlebrook both met the required benchmarks of 70%. I just want to finish the CMT discussion tonight by talking about cohorts. A cohort is the same group of students as they move from one grade to the next. The state reports year-to-year results of the same grade level, not cohort. They're not tracking the same children as they go along. But Wilton has always considered how the same group of students perform as they move from one grade level to the next to be very important. And we definitely track their achievement over time. We track it by tracking the percent of students who achieve mastery within a cohort year after year after year. And we also track it by using vertical scale scores, which is a very valid measure designed by psychometricians at the state to measure growth and achievement within the same group of students over time and across grades. Now, the scores of all our cohorts show growth and achievement over time, as well as a strong upward trend in the percent of students who achieve these goals. This is really something to celebrate and something that we're very proud of as a district. And studies of all our cohorts and their growth and achievement over time can be found in the district testing report on pages 85 to 95. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tim again to talk about the CAP.
Thank you, Lynn. The Connecticut Academic Performance Test is administered to grade 10 students in the state of Connecticut. This is a standard assessment administered to all grade 10 students, again, across the state. It is aligned with high performance standards and emphasizes the application and integration of skills in realistic contexts. So, not to be repetitive, the format in terms of reporting of the data is very similar to what Lynn described with the CMT. So, I'm just going to move on and get right into an explanation of the data. This is the performance of last year's sophomores, our grade 10 students at Wilton High School. And you can see that in math we scored at 83.6%, science 81.4%, reading 78.7%, writing 90.2%. Again, these are students who have scored at the mastery level, which is score 4 or higher. In terms of an analysis of results, the score in reading, again, was below 80%, math and science above, writing at right at the 90% marker. It's our strong belief that we need to compare these scores to trends over time. So, for example, the score in math was relative to other years lower than our 3-year average, so that's something we need to look at, but there's a relativeness to the score. Our science performance in science, 3-year average, somewhat consistent with this year's performance at 79%, reading 82%, and the 3-year average in writing is 91%. Science, we're proud of our performance in 2011. That percentage hitting mastery increased, and the percent of students achieving mastery in math, reading, and writing decreased in 2011 compared to 2010. The percent of students scoring at or above goal on all 4 tests, which is quite an accomplishment, was 65%, which is the highest, second highest in 5 years. So in terms of comparing our performance across the state, we certainly do well as it relates to statewide averages. And as a district, we compare favorably to other schools in our demographic reference group. But at the same time, I would suggest there's 2 areas of concern, trying to be transparent about our report, and that is in the area of math. As Lynn mentioned earlier, we grow concerned when our performance here in Wilton falls below the DERG A average. So that math score is something for us to take a good hard look at it. But again, I think we have to be careful about the context of that. For example, the last 2 years, we were first in our DERG in math performance. Science above the DERG average, reading below. Reading is a concern. You may recall the 3-year average in that area was somewhat consistent with the DERG average. So we're tracking that in a way that's, I would say, of greater concern than the math performance. And then the writing performance does remain remarkably good at the 90% level. So the calculation of AYP, the CAPT, is a very important high-stakes exam because it does, it's the instrument used by the state of Connecticut for No Child Left Behind standards. The metrics that are used to achieve AYP are similar to the CMT in terms of participation, accountability, the same type of organizing principle is used to establish benchmarks. You see the benchmarks are in the areas of math and reading, and we add the indicator of graduation rate at the high school level. You need to be at 70%. Of course, in a school like ours, we're up in the mid-90s. So here you see the results under NCLD. Again, you see a significant increase in the benchmarks in math and reading from the previous years, represented by that red line to the black line. And interestingly, although we're concerned about mastery performance, this cohort in the areas of math and reading, when you include the proficient level of performance, we're still remarkably high in our performance at Wilton High School, scoring at the 97% or higher level. One thing we're very proud of at Wilton High School is we're one of approximately 12 high schools in the state of Connecticut that uses GOAL. In other words, score of mastery 4 or 5 for the purposes of performance-based graduation requirements. So not only is performance on the CAP important for No Child Left Behind purposes and all those other reasons that assessments are important, but it's also used as a graduation requirement for our students. Most high schools in Connecticut use this proficient marker as the standard for performance-based graduation requirements. We use GOAL. So we have to revert back to that other chart that I showed you in terms of trying to assist students grow in their skills And what this yields is a number of students who need to take the CAP again as juniors, which again is very unusual in the state of Connecticut because we use score 4 or higher. So under NCLB, we had the special ed subgroup. We needed to report on that in the math area because we had a cohort size of 40 or greater. And we did achieve AYP, but through Safe Harbor, as Lynn described before, all the other, the total group and participation graduation, we met the AYP standards. So this gives you a sense of what I was talking about previously, where it's important to look at performance over time. And in the math area, if you look at the 4-year trends, you can see that the blue bars there, that we are seeing a slight downward trend in performance over time. It's really important to understand you're comparing different groups of students on a particular CAP instrument in that year, so you have to be careful about drawing those comparisons. But in effect, we do look at that, and we want to work with our math department, Mr. Sanso and his oversight of the department, to take a good hard look at that this year and try to determine what might be influencing that trend. And the science performance, again, has been remarkably consistent and relative to the DIRG, quite strong. The reading performance remains somewhat variable over time. Again, we're really trying to intervene in the reading area because we just think it's so important as it relates to performance for students across their entire academic program. And then in the writing area, we just remain very strong in our performance. So Lynn's going to take you through the SAT now.
Talk about SAT. The SAT assesses student reasoning based on knowledge and skills that they develop in their coursework. The SAT is required by many colleges and universities in order for students to be considered for admission. It consists of 3 sections since 2006: math, critical reading, and writing. Scores in each section range from 200 to 800. And then the scores for each section are also added together for what's called a composite score, with 2,400 being considered a perfect score. SAT scores for Wilton students in the class of 2011 were outstanding. The reading average for Wilton students was 598 compared to, it was a 23-point increase compared to 2010, and well above state and national averages of 509 and 497 respectively. The writing average for Wilton students was 610 this past year, a 17-point increase compared to 2010, and well above state and national averages of 513 and 489. And the math average for Wilton students was 597 in 2011, with a 3-point decrease compared to the prior year, and well above state and national averages. Now, as we have said this evening several times, looking at averages over time is important when analyzing scores and evaluating student performance. There will be some fluctuation from year to year because it's a different cohort, different group of students, and different tests each year. But the 5-year SAT averages for the district are solid, weighing in at 587 in reading, 597 in writing, and 600 in math. How do we compare to other schools? Wilton students continue to perform well above state and national averages in reading, writing, and math on the SAT year after year. In 2011, Wilton had the highest reading average in the state, the highest writing average in the state, and the 5th highest math average in the state. With respect to our demographic reference group, DRGA, Wilton scored above the DIRG average in reading by 20 points, above the DIRG average in writing by 18 points, and above the DIRG average in math by 4 points. Wilton had a composite score of 1195 for reading and math, 23 points higher than the DIRG average, and a composite score of 1810 for reading, writing, and math combined, 46 points higher than the board average. With respect to other schools, Wilton was above the Durg average in reading, writing, and math, and well above state and national averages. Now we're going to talk about the advanced placement.
Three cheers for the class of 2011. Powerful group of students. And that's also going to be notably apparent in the results as it relates to our AP examination, advanced placement. We are very proud of our record at Wilton High School in terms of encouraging students to take rigorous coursework in a range of courses across the school. There's been a steady increase in the percentage of students enrolled in AP courses, a broad range offered. And as you know, AP courses are college-level courses that are accepted by some colleges and universities for credit. And all students, although not required, the vast majority do take the AP exam in May. Some of the data points for the AP summary this year, again, 21 courses. It's remarkable, 328 students took AP courses. The total AP course enrollment, the total enrollment, 715. And the total AP course enrollment, 690 for grades 11 and 12. So even sophomores are taking AP courses in some areas. What we like to do is we like to track the ratio of students taking AP courses compared to the junior-senior enrollment. And we have a very strong track record at the high school of maintaining a high ratio of courses per junior-senior enrollments. We administered 652 AP exams in May under the leadership of Ken Zemo, our AP test coordinator. It's remarkable that 575 students received a score of 3 or greater on those exams. In fact, that's a school high. It ties a school high in terms of percentage of students scoring at that level. And we were recognized by the College Board as one of a handful of schools across the nation. Even a school like ours, we were able to increase the percentage of students taking AP courses without sacrificing quality, which we're really proud of. We have lowered the gates to AP enrollment. Of course, that comes at a cost. You know, as principal these prior years, and now with Bob at the helm, you do worry about student stress because students are taking a wide range of courses. So I think we have to be a little bit careful about celebrating that effort. I'm not sure that percentage should go higher. We need to be careful about that. So, again, a significant increase in number of tests given while maintaining quality performance, and 117 students last year received a distinction of being named AP Scholars. AP likes to put this metric out where they look at equity and excellence. They do that by comparing the percentages of students enrolled in coursework who scored 3 or higher on at least one AP exam. You see the results for students in grades 10, 11, and 12. So we had 50% of our students grades 10, 11, and 12 enrolled in an AP course who scored at least 3 or higher on one of the exams they took. And then you can see that there you go again, the class of 2011. 58% of our graduating class of 2011 scored 3 or higher on at least one AP exam at some point in their high school years. And you can see that is the highest percentage that we've scored in that area over time. I was lucky to go out with that cohort. But at the same time, there's only one direction Bob O'Donnell can go with the CAP scores. So it's all a balance. And there you see the results over time and how that 88% marker doesn't reflect the strength of the class of 2011. But again, Wilton High School students participate in AP curriculum work, and they do score well on the tests that they take. And of course, we do like to take a look at the profile of our graduating seniors to see where they're accepted into schools across the nation. We look at the most competitive, highly competitive schools as ranked by Barron's. And the class of 2011, as you can see, 54% of those students are now attending the most competitive or highly competitive schools and universities across our country. So we're proud of that. So to summarize, again, we've shared with you the results of some of the standardized assessments that are given across the district. We appreciate your patience in allowing us this opportunity to take you through the results. We are proud of our students. Again, we like to emphasize that this is a K-12 effort, and our performance on the CMT, CAP, and SAT tells us important information about student strengths and growth areas. It helps inform instruction and assessment. We like to track performance of our cohorts over time. We look at these scores in depth. We break down the data. Our instructional leadership teams work very closely to use this information to, again, help students develop their skills. And again, I think we take great pride in the fact that we try to be open and honest about our performance. You've heard us report tonight on those areas where we're performing well, but you've also heard us report to you about those areas where we're flying, let's say, cautionary flags, to take a good hard look at some of the reasons why students may be performing what we consider to be slightly below expectation. So we're pleased at this point to take your questions, and I think what we'll do is maybe head up to the front table.
Well, thank you very much. Tremendous amount of work went into that. Boy. Delegation.
Team effort. Team effort.
It truly is a team effort.
Oh. Yeah. So we'll open it up for questions. Yeah.
I'll just start with a kind of broad look for the moment and just ask you how, from your perspective, you feel the results will focus your work in the year ahead and beyond that. And if you could, and if it makes sense, how does that tie into the strategic initiatives for the district?
Well, my impulsive reaction to your question is to automatically look at those areas that I think require attention. But I make that comment hesitantly because all areas require attention. But I do think, we are unusual here in Wilton in that we have the transition from buildings from grade 2 to grade 3. And although all of our comparable districts in Durgay, there's somewhat of a consistent pattern of performance in grade 3 relative to the other grade levels that is below what we would expect. So I think one area that we look at, which has a piece that's related to the strategic plan, is how well are we supporting the transition of grade 2 to grade 3 students, and then the second part of that is, how well are we preparing these third graders to take these exams at that point. Most notably, as I recall, we were looking at the area of math and writing in grade 3 as focus areas. I think the second response I would make, just in terms of my overall view as assistant superintendent, is I do think we need to continue to take a good hard look at the extent to which we're maximizing our students' performance in the critical reading area. That plays out very well on the CMT over time. In fact, our students in general almost test out of the CMT in grades 7 and 8. And then they face a different type of experience in grade 10 on the CAP, which again is a test that's asking students to apply what they know and do across the disciplines. That requires a different type of skill set. So that effort to try to maximize student performance again in the area of reading, ramping up to the grade 10 CAP test is an area of focus for us. I don't know if anything else emerged. I'm addressing your question around areas of focus.
Yep. And that was the intent.
Oh, good. Okay.
Are those documented anywhere? Are they documented anywhere?
They're on the action plans.
In the action plans.
For each of the schools.
In terms of
What we're doing.
Oh, it's in the action plans for the schools?
Right.
Yes, which are in the last pages.
They also would, you would...
So it wouldn't be under actions taken in response to the 2011 CMT and CAP?
That's in response to the CMT and CAP specifically, but the building reports go into they talk about the CMT and CAP, but they also go into more depth about building level assessments and other things that are going on besides what we spoke about tonight.
It also drills down to the individual student level in terms of the extent to which you're developing action plans to respond to the personalized learning needs of those students who perhaps perform below expectation for them as individuals.
Have curriculum maps not been developed for the areas that we need you could consider weak or needing work?
Fair question, but I think we need to be careful about concluding that process would necessarily impact performance on these exams. The curriculum maps have been completed in social studies and science, and the extent to which that effort certainly is creating, I would hope, increased likelihood that students are receiving assured instructional experiences across those areas is certainly contributing to the performance of our students. But at the same time, just because we haven't started that process, for example, in the area of English and language arts to the same degree, this isn't to suggest that there isn't significant work going on at the grade levels 3 through 10 on making sure that our curricula is aligned with the standards, state standards, and now, of course, the new Common Core standards, and that there's strong not only, again, personalized interventions with students, but also programmatic interventions to respond to any areas of concern in those other two areas. So it's like, the question very often is, how does technology influence student learning? You got to be very careful about isolating variables. So I would never say that curriculum maps may not influence student performance. Otherwise, why would we be doing it? But at the same time, I'd be careful to suggest that the fact that we haven't done that in a particular content area would suggest that our performance is being impacted by that.
Am I remembering correctly that third grade had large class size last year? I'm wondering if there was if that had any influence.
Find out
I
next
don't
meeting.
think it was about 300 students, just over 300. So that's not unusually large.
Okay.
Third grade, this current third grade
Okay.
class is a larger class than last year.
Okay.
Oh, that's it.
All right. Thank you.
We strongly believe that class size impacts student performance. The extent to which we would be able to isolate that variable as it relates to performance in grade 3 this year would be quite difficult. But at the same time, we want to be very careful with the board that they understand that class sizes that become well above acceptable ranges will absolutely impact the extent to which we can work individually, particularly with those students who are what we call on the cusp students. Those students who may not be identified under special ed or Section 504, who really need personalized attention to maximize their performance. And it's very often students in the middle or on the cusp that will be impacted when your class size ranges become unacceptable. It's a very good question.
You see some regression, kids who barely made, like Tim said, very made standards, and then regress.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems to me it's something to be aware of, and since third grade this year is so large, it's concerning.
Well, I think we have to really look at that and be mindful of class size averages. It's one of the issues we're facing at the high school. As I reported to the board over the last 2 years, we've seen significant increases in class size in mathematics at the high school. Now, I would hesitate to conclude that our performance in math may be associated with that. It's a much more challenging exercise than to isolate that variable. There could be many other factors. It could be that particular cohort.
Sure.
But we do need to be, we need to keep our eyes on that prize.
Can you give us a sense? We're looking at a very relatively narrow range of scores when we look at our DRG schools and our own. Can you give us a sense of what the statistical significance is within that narrow range? When we're talking about literally single question, 2 questions on a test that can make a difference from year to year, or is it Is it a larger number than that?
The state will never give you
We've
a
tried.
definitive answer on this. In some of the graduate coursework I did over time, there was some suggestion made that you could see, for example, on the capped, you could see variability of 2 percentage points as it relates to a mean percentage that would be statistically insignificant. And that's why we want to be very careful. If you have 9 schools, for example, that you rank from low to high, and the variability of the range of performance is within those 2 points either side, it could in fact be statistically insignificant and could relate to the performance of maybe 10 or 12 students that's bringing that overall mean down. So, I think you have to look at that as there is some statistical significance or insignificance around. Now, the state just won't go there.
They will not give us that. They will not give us that.
Well, I think it's probably, even for a statistician, it would be a difficult construct to develop and draw a conclusion over. But I just personally tend to look at 2 percentage points on either side as being somewhat comparable in terms of performance. It's almost more useful to look at 5-point ranges when comparing DERG averages.
You had mentioned the importance of looking at DERG averages. And looking at the CMT results, it looks like there's 20 different bar graphs here. We're below the DERG average in 10 of those. So I'm kind of concerned about that. Although I look at the SAT scores, and those obviously look good. My question, and obviously we're all concerned about grade 3, but you kind of glossed over the cohort charts, and looking at the 3rd grade classes, it goes into 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, in, I think you said pages 85 to 92. And then these all look pretty darn good to me. Can you talk about that and how this information may actually be a better analysis of how the district's doing than this, which doesn't look very good?
It absolutely is a very valid analysis of tracking performance over time. To make goal in one grade to the next, the standards are so much higher. So even if you learn everything you needed to know the year before, you're not going to make goal the next year. You have to learn more to continue to increase your performance. So it's a very valid way, and that's what we like to use to track performance over time. I just want to point out that in the DERG comparison bar charts, that a lot of times when we're below the DERG average, we're still over 90% last grade. So
I understand.
When you're at such a high level of performance, you can't always increase.
And then also you have to factor in, as it relates to the previous question, what that range is in terms of statistical significance. I don't mean to downplay.
I think we had a discussion last year where that swing could be as few as 2 or 3 or 4 children. So I understand that, and it's important that the town understands that as well. But at the same time, we're competing with our DERG towns. I mean, the bottom line is we compete with them for placing our kids in colleges. We compete with them for real estate values. We compete with them on the football field. So beating the DERG average is kind of important. And I want to make sure that we keep, at least that's my personal opinion. I'm not speaking for anybody beyond myself. So I want to make sure that we're keeping our eye on that ball, but at the same time, I want to make sure you're getting credit for this, because this is pretty impressive. And I want to make sure that people see it and understand that that 3rd grade class is getting better and better, and that's probably in large part why we're doing well on SAT scores.
I respect the point of view. As you might suspect, I wouldn't use the word compete to describe our analysis as it relates to comparing our performance across the DERG. We feel it's important, perhaps for some of the reasons you described. It's certainly a measure of performance that provides a benchmark relative to other schools in the area that are like ours. But the other piece, that we need to be mindful of, again, is you're comparing different cohorts. You're comparing schools that may be of different sizes. You're comparing schools that may have different percentages of students in the cohort who are identified with a range of learning challenges. And the other piece where it becomes very important is more on around the idea of, when we see that we're below the dirt average, what we like to do is try to determine what those schools are doing who are scoring above us. They might be doing things programmatically or using a range of instructional approaches that might vary from ours. So we want to learn from them. So we understand the perspective around competition, but what's most important to us as educators is working together with our comparable schools. I sit on the CES Curriculum Council, and we have these conversations. We want to learn from each other. And it may be that surrounding school districts are trying different types of approaches that are really impacting performance in a way that could benefit us. So I appreciate the perspective, but there's other ways of looking at it that can also benefit our school district.
Is that where a discussion of Chicago math versus Singapore math might come in?
In any content area, you would look perhaps at programmatic review. You just raised the example in the area of math. It could be in any area. You could also look at resources, quite frankly. The extent to which school districts in our DIRG, we've talked to you about how there's coaching models available in some districts that we don't have. So you want to look at not only programmatic issues, you want to look at how they're using their resources in a way. They may have, for example, Joe Barlow High School is renowned for its writing lab approach to support students that have deficiencies in that area. Those type of instructional modalities are also important to look at as ways to try to consider, what we could do to support our schools. I don't mean to I don't want to imply in any way that local school districts may be outperforming us because they have more resources. That's not my intent. It's more around the instructional approach they use with the resources they have available to them.
And I just want to point out, too, to your question that I tried to talk tonight, and Tim as well, about averages over time. Because a lot of times when I create these charts, it's the same numbers, and the schools just flip around. Westport, Wilton, Westport. We just sort of flip around from year to year.
Well, so
the
math
rather
score,
than
right?
looking at, this is one piece of data point that we look at, but we also want to look at a trend over time, and we don't want to see it consistently doing this.
Speaking of trends over time, you have a cohort that where mastery decreased in math, reading, and writing from 2010 to 2011. If you were to go back and look at their mastery scores, say from 5th grade to 8th grade, and then look at their CAP scores, would we find that this is a cohort that has shown growth and achievement over that period?
Well,
I realize that it's
you
not
can jump in
apples to
as well.
apples.
I think there's some validity to your question if you're comparing vertical scale scores, which Mr. Likely had just demonstrated, within the CMT environment. There's been a lot of work done on the extent to which CMT performance, even in a cohort that's struggling, will predict CAP performance, and there doesn't seem to be relationships. There seems to be some evidence that a score on the 6th grade reading, CMT, may correlate with the reading across the discipline score on the CAPT. So it's very important not to draw that distinction between the CMT and the CAPT. At the same time, though, there certainly is evidence, and you heard me celebrating the class of 2011 in terms of its SAT and AP performance. There's compelling evidence that certain cohorts of students may demonstrate outstanding performance over time or less outstanding, and I'm going to say less outstanding performance over time just because of the nature of those particular groups of students.
Right.
What we take great pride in is the extent to which we try to downplay that, because we're going to look at the individual student in any cohort, and we're going to do everything we can to elevate their performance. So it's too easy at times, I think, for educators to say, well, that 8th grade score doesn't reflect concerns around practice because they didn't perform well in grade 5. This is a group of kids that is struggling, and it's just pervading over time. Our approach is to say, we're going to look at each individual student that's not meeting our expectation in terms of maximizing their potential, in terms of whatever cohort they're in, and we're going to try to maximize their achievement. So you have to be careful about labeling cohorts of students, whether they perform at the highest levels of performance or at lesser levels.
That said, is there anything in looking back into, drilling into the data, that would allow you to predict the performance of the class of 2011 on the SAT? In other words, is this a class that consistently performed well throughout?
There seems to, this is a very informal observation I'll make, but I certainly watch the performance on the CAPT to see, and this is over my tenure as an administrator at the high school, I used to watch the performance of the CAPT to see if there was any predictor of whether that would lead to significant performance, significant meaning scores above, say, 5-year or 3-year trends on the SAT or the AP aggregate scores. It's just a dangerous exercise. There's so many variables that come into play. You even look at our SAT cohort in the class of 2011. I think it was approximately 275 students who took that test, and were scored on it out of a group that I believe we graduated 305 last year. So, who were the 35 students, or the 30 students, pardon my math, who didn't take that test? So you just have to be really careful about that kind of predictive analysis about cohort trends. There's absolutely no doubt that there's some predictive analysis that does indeed lead one to conclude that particular cohorts may struggle in aggregate over time or perform well over time. But again, we try to be careful about that. It's helpful in some respects, it's not helpful in other respects. I don't know if I answered your question.
No, you did.
Okay.
My turn. I just have a couple comments. As a district, we compared favorably to the other schools in our demographic reference group. And as Bruce just pointed out, we actually were below the majority of Matric. So how do you see that we performed favorably?
Well, I think that goes back to the point that we're above 90% mastery in many of those cases. So that's a pretty high percentage of achievement.
Which is fine on our own.
And
but when compared to the others,
it goes back to the 2-point plus or minus point spread as well. The ranges are not that big in a lot of those grade levels.
I would buy that argument more if we were up last year and down this year, but I just don't see a trend up. You know what I'm saying?
Well,
we had this conversation last year too, so I don't want to prolong it. But.
Well, I'll just respond by suggesting, as we said before, that when we talk about that bullet point in the presentation that we compare favorably, we're talking about our performance this year against our Durg A. We also, at the same time, though, were careful to point out to the board those areas where we're concerned about 3-year trends. And that's something that I think we tried to be transparent about. For example, in the area of math performance at the CAP. I apologize for keep talking about the CAP. It's the test I know the best. But there's a 3-year downward trend on the CAP in the math area, and I think we've been honest and open on that, and we're looking at it. So it may be that in our presentation next year to the board, it might be a good suggestion based on your question, Mr. Sachs, that we report more directly on those trends.
I just would like to see the trend go up. That's basically what I'd like to see. And when you talk year over year, I see statements like CMT writing analysis of results. In 2010, we stated the percent of students achieving mastery in 7 decreased by 5 percentage points in 2010 compared to 2009. And then we increased our group in this year. The percentage of students achieving mastery in 3, 5, 7, and 8 decreased in 2011 compared to 2010. So I would say that that's clearly at least a 2-year trend. And I'm curious what we're doing to address that. I mean, did that jump out at you as well?
I might have to.
I'm not sure. What subject are you looking at?
Well, it's page 11 on your PowerPoint.
So the writing?
Yeah. 3rd bullet, 2nd sentence.
That's just stating a fact.
Right, but in your presentation from last year, you stated the fact, too, that it was decreasing. So, I mean, that's obviously a 2-year trend. I'm just curious if that jumped out at you, too, and if it didn't, that's fine.
Well, I'd like to suggest that that we would be looking closely at that, in the spirit of the earlier comment, that if we begin to see trends of performance declining over time, that we would indeed intervene. I'd like to think we intervene even in those years when we see a 1-year decrease. We just need to be very careful about overreacting to it for all the variables we described before.
I understand.
Right.
Sat here fourth time. Yeah, understand.
There you go.
I think to your point, it would be helpful to me to look at multiple years in each of these areas and look at those trends, to Mr. Sachs's point, but also to Mr. DeVos's point. A couple of percentage points here or there, you can't measure on those because it could come down to just a couple of kids. And that's why looking at it over 3 or 4 years makes sense. And that's also why I think looking at the performance of the cohort over time is valuable. And I want to make sure we pull that out because I think you're doing a good job there.
Well, I would encourage the board, and perhaps this should have been more part of the presentation, but for example, on page 17 in the testing report, we do report out on performance over time. Now, we could drill down and do that to a greater extent across the DIRG, et cetera. So there is certainly a greater level of specificity within the report that addresses these questions over progress year over time. I don't mean to. I'm not suggesting this isn't said in jest, but part of our responsibility here is try to present an executive summary to the board, lest we be here 6 hours. So.
You're doing a great job, and
yeah.
I think we're just saying is maybe if you could summarize some of this, if it's another slide.
Well, listen, in fairness, if it's going to be something that we're going to emphasize, then it should be brought forward to a greater extent in our presentation.
The cohort is a great, is a good story. We have to tell them that.
Right.
That's one.
And putting it up on the website and pointing to it is
Right.
a great step to do that.
Well, we appreciate the comment and suggestion.
Yeah, because conversely, the SAT stories is a great story to tell, and at the end of the day, kind of to Bruce's point, that's what we're all here for, right?
But I'm just going to say, a year from now,
I was just
I won't be
thank
here.
you.
Some other people are going to be sitting here, and that score may drop by 13 points. Or
So we have an
points, and
experienced board.
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
What,
Part of our deliberation was understanding we had a very veteran, experienced board, and we didn't have to go into that level of detail. Next year we will.
It is variable from year to year.
It does. You have to be really careful about celebrating success at different levels and then celebrating what people might describe as concern areas.
And I think that's why long-term trends are really what we want to do.
I had 1 year when I was principal in California. We had 22 national merit finalists. And I was ready to be anointed emperor, and I had nothing. I'd like to say I took full credit, but next year I had 8, which is still a large number. And it was a different cohort. We looked like bums, down to 22 to 8.
We've seen that here, though.
Yeah, we've seen some.
Well, I think also I would be cautious about saying SATs are what we're all here for, or that's the bottom line. I don't think that's true. I think, as you showed us in that lovely little graphic in the beginning, test scores are one part of the puzzle of education.
What is interesting is the ACT in some ways has more interesting predictive quality to it, because it really looks. The SAT has been proven not to be a good predictor of anything, other than maybe the first semester in college. And the ACT really has a projection of how if you get above the bench, you saw above the benchmark scores, it says when you go to college you will be B or better. That's the prediction. It's kind of interesting that more students are taking the ACTs, and we see that in some
of the class now. 50% of the
we see that in the
graduating
Midwest. A lot of the New Trier, the high-performing districts around Chicago. The ACT that's the one that they really
some more Midwestern.
We share the results of the ACT and the executive summary in the report, and we've been deliberating. We're probably 1 year away if current trends what we're seeing now, including that in our overall presentation to the public, because again, we'll be the third year of having close to 50% of the senior class take the ACT. It's a significant change. It's also impacting the extent to which our teachers need to be mindful of that in helping to prepare students for the ACT now, not just the SAT.
The other thing is that I think it's important to look at critical transition points. And clearly, 8th grade, as students are getting ready to move to the high school, the question becomes: how do they compare? Are they well prepared?
Right.
Have they the skills? Have they demonstrated the skills that they need to move on to the high school? And so, I'm less concerned in some ways with the interim schoolers, because there is growth over time. But 8th grade is a key point, I think, to measure in terms of preparation.
And I also think, to Mrs. Myers' point, it's not just about the wide-ranging comprehensive programs that we offer. It's also about acknowledging that we want to have curriculum standards in our district that challenge students. We could easily celebrate the success of our 7th and 8th grade cohorts on the CMT and rest on our laurels, but quite frankly, if you have 90 to 95% of your students hitting mastery on that exam, one could conclude that you better be having a curricular experience that's more rigorous and challenging. So we like to look at our. I talked to the Central Curriculum Council about this in our meeting back in September. We certainly want to make sure that our curriculum is aligned with the expectations and standards for these exams, and we need to prepare students for them because of all the things we talked about. But it's almost more essential that we have in place a relevant and rigorous curriculum experience that will create a cohort of students that's better prepared for what's coming next than just these measures of performance on these standardized assessments will suggest to us.
I'll bring up another trend that concerns me, but at the same time there is some silver lining in it as well, which is the college attendance rates and the schools that our kids are getting into. The graph that you put up showed schools relative to most competitive and highly competitive. And if you look at it over a 3-year trend, we're putting fewer and fewer kids in most competitive schools, yet we're growing in highly competitive. Now, that concerns me when I think about things like enrichment, but then at the same time, if you add up the percentages in here over the 3-year period and combine them, it's rising.
Well,
which is great.
Certainly, we acknowledge the analysis. I think you have to be very careful, once again, about trying to draw relationships around causality for example, that decline in students getting into the most competitive schools. One argument in that one cohort that was so high, as you'll remember, that was the year the economy changed. There was some evidence that more students at Wilton High School were getting into Ivy League schools than had been consistent in the past, because the schools were identifying these students as students who would be able to pay. So that's just one example. I'm just going to say this out loud. I don't know if it's true or not, but it may have been a year where we had 2 or 3 students going to Harvard instead of 1 because of economic considerations. So I don't want to in any way imply that that's the reason why you see that downward trend, but it'd be an example of an indicator you'd want to look at. You'd want to look at the distribution of students who went to schools that are categorized as such.
I think we're also hitting the bubble of high school seniors in terms of sheer numbers in this country. So getting into college is more competitive.
That could be another variable. But it does raise the point that we like to add the 2 together.
Right.
But it also raises the point we need to be looking at trends. And that's a 3-year trend, and we need to be monitoring it.
The other variable, too, that I've always thought about in this, and that is that looking at kids in our area tend to apply to the same groups of colleges. And I think one thing that happens sometimes, I think colleges have tried desperately to be more geographically, diverse. So you really do see, you see more enrollment. Sometimes you see some shifts from the Midwest and the West into some of these eastern schools where our kids traditionally have gotten. So I don't know what role that plays, but I always wonder about that piece of it.
To me, that's not something you should be attaching the reputation and evaluation of the school onto. It's too uncontrollable, admissions in college. And it also, what does that say for the kids in the middle who are going to go to just fine schools, but, they're educating them is equally as important as educating someone who's going to go to an Ivy League school, and it's very concerning to me to have us put so much pressure on that as a tool for evaluating the district.
How many did we send to Ivy League school last year?
I don't know. I could get that number for you. You do receive, I believe you received a copy of the Class of 2011 college report where all that information is put together by Sue Mangan and our guidance team.
I read that. I think we just sent one.
I think
we sent one.
No, the number of children who get into Ivy League schools is more important than the number who actually go, because some kids get in and don't go.
That's absolutely true.
I've got a question that has sort of been lingering in my mind for some time. I guess it's not really reflected here, but have you done any sort of gender analysis? Are you concerned at the high school level for? Because I think there was a report, or I read something last year about the number of males going into AP courses that it had dropped significantly over the last few years, and I'm just wondering if anything in all of your work has...
We report on the disaggregation of data as it relates to gender in the report. We do that for the CMT. I believe we do it for the CAP. We do it for the SAT. It's interesting. I hadn't heard that in my experience on AP participation. We haven't looked at AP participation on a gender-based dynamic. It'd be something to look at.
When we were preparing for the town meeting last year, I seem to remember seeing something and it jumped out at me.
Right. We do look at gender performance. One of the things we look at, for example, are the GPA performance of students, male and female. It's like anything. When you disaggregate the data, you need to be careful about what it tells you. You need to relate it to current research on gender performance. And at the end of the day, it all boils down to that specific student, whether special ed or not, whether 504 or not, whether male or female, whatever subgroup they're coming from. You need to try to identify whatever you can to help them understand what it is, what their growth areas are, and as educators make them. But certainly gender breakdown is something we do look at.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's a lot of work. Good job. And we'll jump from the testing report to
This is going on the website.
policy 51.
Yes.
Yes. Policy 5123, grade placement.
I'll be right back.
Okay. Mr. Candy will switch hats.
As the board knows, we've been working to identify those policies that have not been reviewed recently over time. And tonight, we're bringing to your attention the grade placement policy 5123, which was last reviewed, believe it or not, in 1985. I guess the board back at that time developed an effective policy because it's worked well for us.
We did.
Was that seniority comment?
We do, as you know, in the bullying policy, we in the presentation, we talked about the research we do to update our language, and in this case tonight, we did reference the CAVE documents around policy formulation to make sure that we had language that we felt was more current and more aligned with our current practice. But again, the policy 5123, we just expanded the language, I think, to just be more broad-based and really get to the spirit here of the policy process that we use to promote students within our district. Certainly, you heard me mention a moment ago about our efforts to promote a curriculum that is based on the highest standards of performance. We do work very hard to monitor performance over time in a systematic way. Hopefully, our well-established systems of grading and reporting academic achievement are valid and reliable over time, and it's what we use to promote students and ultimately to decide their status as it relates to graduation. So decisions around placement can either be from grade to grade, or at the high school level can be around access to instructional programs. And at the end of the day, in the middle of the third paragraph, you see what I think is the summary statement, which we base these decisions on successful completion of the curriculum, attendance, performance on statewide testing program and other standardized tests, which a few of which we just discussed, academic potential and student aptitude. And these decisions shall not be promoted based upon age or other social reason not related to academic performance. At the end of the day, the vast majority of our students are moving through the system with their age peers. The final piece of the policy is to have a process in place with those students where retention may be recommended. And there's a process that we follow where we work with the teachers, the parents, any instructional support personnel, and at the end of the day, the principal makes the final decision on promotion or retention as it relates to individual students. It's decided on an individual basis. And then, of course, we have the obligation of looking at the instructional needs of that student and making sure that any kind of remedial plan is put in place to make sure that they're in fact, if indeed academic performance is the variable that dictates promotion, then in fact, if there's acknowledgement that the skills need to be addressed, then there needs to be some type of remedial plan in place in the coming school year to address those needs. So I'll tell that's the summary of the policy, and I'd be glad to take any questions you have.
I assume that if you have a child who's in a modified program, the decision whether or not to promote them is based on whether or not they meet the objectives set out in their IEP. Is that correct? Would that be correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
How frequently do you have to utilize this? How many kids are we talking about a year that we have to make that evaluation of?
There are very few situations. At the high school, it's in some ways students progress based on the coursework that they're taking. They, in fact, may graduate after 4 years. The vast majority of our students do. They may need a fifth year. At the K-8 level, again, you probably could count on one or two hands.
2 fingers that we could even consider.
Over your experience as principal?
In 14 years?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very
What about the lower grades?
You would see it most frequently the lower the grade the child is.
Right.
But that being said, you consider many variables. And you never make the decision without considering the criteria that Tim has set in place, that all the people at the table.
Understand. I was just trying to understand magnitude. Two at Meadowbrook in 14 years.
We have more conversation about it, and we have more that are considered. But that being said, you have very few every year.
Less than a dozen?
Oh, absolutely. Less than 5.
Okay.
In any given grade.
And at what point in the year does that conversation begin?
We hesitate to make a decision very early in the school year because we consider that, we have to consider the child's going to have a school year to do it. So we usually don't even think about it till the last quarter, around March, after one of the last marking periods, because you have to give the child opportunities to have instruction, and there are a lot of, as I said, there are a lot of variables. If it's totally an attendance thing, and the child hasn't been there all year, and that's a different kind of thing you can look at earlier in the year. If it's something that's just instruction and how things are going for them, but we always say that there are, you look at the social, emotional, educational, academic, the whole big picture for a child. So usually towards closer to the end of the year that you can get, you start the conversation. You never make the decision until the end of the year.
And then in Cider Mill, it's probably smaller numbers than that.
We left a child back last year who had come into the system. Parents had made a decision about a grade. To Tim's point about the academic component, they made it based on the prior school in a different state. They were pretty adamant about it. We began conversations early in the school year, putting in mediation wherever possible, and it became apparent that the child was going to flounder if she stayed, and she was in third grade.
Okay. So it clearly doesn't sound like you have to address it very frequently.
Can I just ask a question as to why you chose to eliminate the statement in the third paragraph that begins, is the philosophy of, that really does identify social emotional issues, and are you saying that those no longer are relevant?
That was not my intent. I think that there was certainly in the policy review a determination that based on the CABE recommended policy, that the criteria that I did emphasize need to be in fact the distinguishing variables. So maturity is in fact a factor that relates to academic achievement. So I think you can't dismiss, as Cheryl said, the social emotional aspects of a student's performance, but it needs to land in the academic environment.
Yeah, it seems to me though that there is an element of that is, if it is part of the analytical construct, we want to at least reference it. And in taking it out entirely, as you read the policy, it basically says essentially if they're based on, in fact it says a student shall not be promoted based upon age or any other social reason not related to academic performance. So if emotional maturity would not be a reason then for holding a child back in consultation with parents.
Well, the spirit of the suggestion would be to try to determine the extent to which it would be appropriate to include language that would in fact indicate that that's a factor contributing to a student's academic performance. Promotion at the end of the day needs to be based on students' academic achievement and the factors that we described there. Again, just trying not to be repetitive. The social emotional aspects, which are quite huge and quite notably expressed in our strategic plan, contribute to that. But at the end of the day, promotion and retention has to be based on the student's academic performance.
It's a different philosophy than stated here.
What I'll do for second read is think about how I might be able to get to the spirit of your comment and the spirit of mine.
Mm-hmm.
There might be a way to do that.
We do emphasize the whole child.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that whole child is a part of this decision making.
Right.
As I listen to you and as I read it, I feel as if the two of you are saying rather different things. It sounded like you're saying age and other factors wouldn't cause a child to be promoted if academics weren't there, and it sounds as if you're saying age and lack of maturity might cause a child to not be promoted.
Correct.
And those are not the same thing, and they're not both in here.
But they're both relevant.
And they're both hugely relevant.
Yeah.
So I feel as if your point isn't really in here, but probably needs to be.
Cheryl had a comment.
I was just going to say, I think that it's somewhere in the middle. I don't think you necessarily have to, even though we consider the variable of social emotional, it's not an isolated variable. That's all I was trying to say. And so it's a piece of all of those, and I think what you're sort of saying the same things actually, it's just maybe semantics that could maybe be looked at again.
Yeah, I think its very absence to me is a statement.
I agree.
And I think that's something that would concern me. And then the other question that I had is just the use of the language of to maintain, in the first paragraph, to maintain the highest standards required for each grade. I'm just wondering, as a Board of Education looking at, with its oversight responsibility, how would we determine whether we were meeting those highest standards? What would they be? Is there a way to get some, and I know it's hard, some level of specificity or other language that is more precise than that?
Well, I think raising that issue is something that requires reflection. I think the spirit of the comment is related to what I talked about earlier, where we want to be sure that we're providing a rigorous instructional experience. Maybe that requires some qualification of the language, but I would hate to I want to be careful about a policy statement that would suggest that, I think it's important that the board goes on record in some way, shape, or form to suggest that we're going to provide a rigorous and relevant instructional experience to students. The extent to which you can't dispute the idea that the highest standards required is somewhat nebulous in terms of quantifying that.
What I was thinking about as you were talking, because the idea of if you had, or maybe I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, are you saying that if you had a kid who made the met the academic standards, the performance standards, the curriculum, but didn't have the social emotional maturity, would you say that student it could be considered to withhold, you might consider withholding that kid, not promoting him because of the social emotional aspects of his or her performance?
I think there might be instances where that could be, and I think in the absence of it suggests that it's not an issue at all. And I don't think that's what we're...
The spirit of the policy and thinking about...
It may be a primary, secondary...
Because I'm sorry.
Yeah, there may be a primary, secondary relationship, but it's not irrelevant. And its absence to me implies that it's not particularly... I sound like I'm defending the policy, and I'm not.
Yeah.
But particularly because it has been in the policy, we're sort of eliminating it and saying it's no longer what we believe. I'm not sure that's true.
Because there have been some difficult conversations, I know that some of our principals have had, where a parent might want to withhold a child, and we've had those conversations too, and we believe the kid has made the academic progress.
Absolutely.
And the difficulty is that, from our perspective, one of the considerations is that if you hold that kid back, who has already mastered the curriculum, you might have some interesting behavioral challenges because he or she might be,
understood.
And that's
but it still ought to be in the mix.
Yeah.
That's all
I
I'm
think
saying.
your point is that.
Well, especially it would seem to me in the very young grades where part of the decision about promotion, I would assume many of the evaluation factors are social and maturity as much as academic, certainly in kindergarten.
The younger and the younger.
Yeah.
Well, I think the construct of maturity is something we could look at to broaden that language. Back to your point, though, about the standards, I could see an argument where you could eliminate that word and just to maintain the standards required for each grade. It may be that that's the appropriate language for this policy around promotion. It's more of a philosophical...
Social, emotional being part of
well,
no, that's a different question. It's a totally different...
I'm looking at
first paragraph to me is a different
paragraph. It's an entirely different question, paragraph 1. You're looking at the phrase, the highest standards.
Right. I'm not sure what that means. I think that's actually, there's some validity to that.
I could see the arguments that for the purposes of promotion that you could simply say maintain the standards
appropriate
required.
standards.
Appropriate, right. That might be a good modification of the language.
So I'm not sure what it would mean, the highest, and I'm not sure how...
Well, the spirit of the language is, again, that we're rigorous, we're relevant, etc.
Not to continue the conversation any longer than it needs to go on, but the word attendance in here, you talk about student academic performance, you talk about performance on testing, completing the curriculum. What relevance does attendance have with that? If you have a situation where, for whatever reason, a child's not been able to attend due to illness, but is still achieving their curriculum? Why is attendance in there?
Well, based on the magnitude of situations we deal with, which lead to retention, which is significantly small, you might conclude that for some of those students, there may have been an attendance-related factor, that because of their intellectual capacity, their inability to be in class, may have impacted. But at the same time, I would suggest that the various homebound programs that we offer, we actually have quite a remarkable record of working with students who are unable to attend school.
I'm fine with your answer. That's
Right. So I think, though, as Cheryl mentioned earlier, attendance does have to be a factor that you look at amongst others when you make this determination around retention, because they may have missed a lot of school for a whole host of reasons.
Causative more than anything else.
Okay, so we'll bring it back for a second reading and look at the first and second paragraph.
Okay. The next policy for your review is once again a policy that was last reviewed in 1993, so it's appropriate to provide updated language. The real motivation around bringing this to the board's attention was to draw.
Which one are we talking about?
I'm sorry. We're going to look at the 1000 series, which is around community relations. I'm going to use a broad-based organizer. The current policy, the only policy that's currently in place that we're reviewing tonight is policy 1110, which is around news releases and printed materials. We're recommending that the board review and discuss 2 additional 1000 series policies for your review. And Policy 1000, for example, which we would like to include in the Policy 1000 series, is around the concept and roles in community relations. And the introduction of this policy we feel is important as it relates to the strategic plan work. Our point of emphasis around community involvement, around building support for our schools as it relates to budget. We felt that this recommended policy really speaks to the spirit of what we're trying to accomplish here in building that relationship between the schools and our community. So Policy 1000 is a new recommendation. Policy 1110 is, in effect, new as well, because the language in the current policy is somewhat outdated and has been, to a large extent, the recommendation is to strike that language and replace it with new language. And then Policy 1112 is indeed new, not part of the current 1000 series, and we're adding that as for your review.
Did we get a red line of this one?
There were none.
Of 1110.
And strike, the whole thing is struck.
The whole thing.
Well, what was the old language?
I don't think we got the old language.
It's 2 pages forward.
I think it's indeed in the it's in the packet that Mr. Dubow's looking at.
Yeah, it's called News Media.
The policy and
Well, we got the new ones. It's the middle one.
Right.
We don't have the red line of that.
Right.
But
We
the entire thing is being stricken.
But it would
It would be helpful to
read the
compare
old one anyway.
the old to the new.
It's there.
It's there.
It's there. That's what's confusing
In the
me.
electronic version?
I don't think it was in the
It
electronic.
wasn't in the electronic
I don't think
version.
in the
No,
electronic
but I have it here.
Not what I
It's in the hard copy
Then
version.
that's
I
my
guess
fault.
that's what's happened.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I definitely don't have it electronically.
I understand.
Can we have 3 chairs for her copy?
Unless it's not in here.
You'll have to look on.
But it's also online.
Yeah, no, exactly.
And you can always look at it online. So I will see when you get this. Thank you.
It's helpful for the
It's just
discussion to
11.
understand that most of the policy language is indeed
10.
Right, it's not noted at the bottom that we are revising something that currently exists.
currently in place. And that's policy, again, 1110.
Okay.
1110 is currently in the 1000 series. But again, to a large extent, it's new language.
Yeah.
It really
We could
is,
see it
yeah.
now.
You can
Down
see
there,
it, yeah.
It needed to be updated. So, my recommendation would be to have you take a look at Policy 1000 to begin. Okay? Which again is new.
And we can come back the next time to talk about the ordinance when you all have it.
Again, Policy 1000 is introduced concept and roles in community relations. And again, the real driver behind the inclusion of this policy, it's referenced in the CABE recommended policies, but was to try to draw significant alignment between a board policy and the strategic plan as it relates to community involvement and the relationship of the schools with the community. So the key language there is around the extent to which members of the community and the schools interact around planning, developing policy, implementing programs, sharing results, that we understand the roles of the schools and the community in that relationship. And it's summarized in a series of 7 statements for the board's review that we would suggest are goals for a successful community relations program, which is to increase understanding of our school system, to build confidence and excitement in our schools, to make sure that we're effective in our distribution of information about our programs and activities, to make sure that we're promoting a climate where we're encouraging community members to voice their opinions about our school system, the extent to which we share resources, not only the community with the school, but the schools with the community, and then to try to promote participation of the community in our various school activities. This is very, again, I hate to belabor the point, but it's significantly aligned with the community involvement strand in the strategic plan, and that's why we felt it important to bring it to the policy level.
I think it's good statement. The only thing I'd say is the first sentence, I think perhaps would read better if we said the Board of Education recognizes that community expectations shape or help shape the quality of local education, because I don't think the community shapes it as much as community expectations do.
Mm-hmm.
But that's...
I think you're right there, because when I read that sentence, I said, well, now what is my role as an elected official?
Right. So
when I read this, my first thought was, given all of the new board members that we have coming on, I'd like to give them the opportunity to look at this before we approve it, because I think they'll have some valuable insight that we'd be able to take advantage of, not only this group but also that group.
It's just on for first reading.
I just noticed it was on for approval on the 22nd of November.
Great. I see what you're saying.
Right. I would think that sure, that's reasonable.
Put it off.
But this is great, tying it in with the strategic plan and potentially even for their benefit, explaining how it ties in. We understand this, we've been through it. So I think this is great.
I like number 4. To solicit and consider community opinions about the school system.
But we have to be careful there not to take the opinion of the squeaky wheels as the opinion of the entire community. We do have to do some due diligence to make sure that we are seeking out many different segments of the community.
Nor do we want to manage the school system by survey,
right.
Which is another aspect of that. We have to be careful of.
Why not? That's where our government lies.
You've made the case.
We'll
Take you to policy 1110. Now this is indeed replaces the current policy 1110. Mm-hmm. And again, the apologies that it's not included in your electronic version, but in effect the language is to a large extent rearranged here for your consideration, and it's to bring this policy up to 21st century practice. Again, a statement around goals in the first paragraph about our obligation to inform the public about school curriculum, programs, and activities, that as we look through the policy, we encourage public input into the decision-making process. It talks about the wide range of means that we can use as a school district to share the news as it relates to publications, press releases, open houses, internet-based communication, etc. It speaks to the use of the websites now that are the Edline website use at both district and the school level to not only communicate information out about the school, but to solicit information in. The responsibility paragraphs in the policy as it relates to the Board of Ed and the Superintendent of Schools. The extent to which we need to understand that some communication does emanate just from one school, and our principals need to be mindful about whether or not that requires, that type of communication requires district involvement because of the nature of that communication and the significance that it could have across the community or the school district. It's important, of course, that when we distribute printed materials or other forms of communication that our staff members are aware of what's happening, and speaks to our obligation to try to find the greatest exposure of our district through a wide range of media outlets to make sure that our coverage is broad-based, balanced, etc. It speaks to your current practice around board minutes, and again, I hope that this provides a more updated and reflection of our current operations in our school district that would be better expressed with this updated policy.
The only thing I don't see here, and I may have missed it, and it's something that we already do, but I think it should be reflected in there, is that televised meeting. And there's no, I don't think it's referenced in here.
The two pieces that I saw might be helpful to add, and I think we're doing a large part of it already, is that all board materials be made available on the website within some reasonable period of time, either before or after the meeting. And then I think it makes sense. We mentioned websites, but I think we need to embrace the fact that social media is not going away, and there's some platform to utilize it.
I tried to acknowledge that by using in the second paragraph the phrase internet-based communications without getting into a range of specificity because of the uncertainty still about the use of some of these cutting-edge practices.
Some of the ones we have are not easy to use.
I also think we have to be careful. There are instances where work product is not necessarily something we'd like to disseminate prior to a meeting.
Understandable.
So I think we have to be just careful in selection of language there.
Right. Where appropriate, every effort be made.
Following a meeting.
But it still may be, if it's still a work product, there are times where you do want to maintain it in that form so it doesn't become a public document. It's just part of.
Isn't it public information though once we present it?
I think not. I mean, I know in previous boards, if it's work product, it's not.
Until it's approved.
Okay.
Okay, so we're done.
Now the next policy is again not part of the 1000 series, and it's recommended that we add this policy to our 1000 series around news media relationships. As high school principal, I'm glad this policy, or former high school principal, I'm glad this policy is coming in after my tenure in that role, because I spent a lot of time working with the news media, as you know, sometimes in not so favorable environments. But anyways, that we have an obligation to work closely with our news media and to promote that relationship, again, to share information about our programs, activities, and events. The board, I think, needs to acknowledge that this is important, and it circles back to the community relations piece. That if you're serious about promoting the district and creating that environment of strong understanding of our practices, then we need to leverage the use of news media to make that happen for us. But we have to be mindful of some constraining variables or protocols that need to be in place in terms of having proper process in place where the media, if they want to work with our students, they need to work with our administration initially. They need to, our school administrators are obligated to be mindful of the permissions and parameters around media access, the extent to which we're very careful about the extent to which presence of the media, particularly when school is in session, can be disruptive to the educational process. And so, again, we need to be careful that if we do allow media to access our schools during those times. At any point where a school-sponsored activity is taking place or school is in session, that the media needs to understand its obligation not to be disruptive in its role. The extent to which there needs to be appropriate identification of any media individual who wants to access our schools, the extent to which the media should be allowed to photograph, broadcast, or record such activities, the extent to which we need to be mindful of whenever there's a opportunity for the media to work with individual students or groups of students, that there needs to be parental involvement if those students are identified in the media. We draw a distinction between that, say a news story about a student or a group of students, a class per se, and then the more broader-based media relationships as it relates to athletics, for example. You see the language there about athletics being more broad-based and being careful to not limit the extent to which students might be identified in that regard. And then there is a disclaimer in the Student Rights and Responsibilities program that's disseminated through our website at the beginning of each school year that includes an opt-out for parents if they do not wish their children to be photographed for school purposes or videotape, special events, etc. So our approach is to use an opt-out as opposed to a more active approach where students have to give permission. We have the parents work with the administration to opt out if they don't want their students to be included in media identification, etc., if that makes sense. So this is, in effect, a policy that we feel needs to be part of the 1000 series. It does, I think, it would have been helpful to me, for example, as a high school principal, if this policy had been in place as I had to interact with the press in a variety of situations, many of which actually took place during the school day. So it's recommended that you take a strong look at this and consider it for a policy recommendation.
I have a concern, the second sentence of the first paragraph, that language may be placing a very heavy burden upon the board and the administration to keep the community apprised of absolutely everything that's going on in the schools.
So too broad.
Yeah.
I see your point, Karen.
The second sentence in the first paragraph starts with therefore.
That sentence, however, is highly related to the first sentence in Policy 1110. It may be that I'd be curious what your reaction is. The first sentence in the 1110 policy, maybe that language would be best. You see the relationship between the two?
I do.
The 1110 language, I think, is softer.
It's much softer.
Programs, activities. You know, it may be that we can soften the language in 1112.
1112 seems to impose the obligation to disseminate that, proactively
and your point
disseminate
is everything.
Doesn't say all.
The concern that I had was one of disruption to the classroom environment, but also a student's right to some level of privacy and autonomy. And I'd like to see a delineation between assemblies or public events and I'll call them private classroom activities. I don't want the media in my kid's math class. Now, if it's some big event and they get all the parents in the classroom to agree to it, that's different. But I don't want to sit around the dinner table and hear that the media was in.
To a large extent, our practice is such that the media will only be on school grounds while school's in session for the reasons you just described. For example, tomorrow, there will be media presence at these significant Veterans Day programs.
But that's by invitation, I assume.
Right. It's by invitation. In those situations where some type of situation has occurred where the media wants to access our school, we typically work with them off school grounds until the time at which school is over. There may be media representatives on during the school day to interview a particular child because of their recent performance. For example, just to give an example, maybe our debate team at the high school just had a recent success, and the media wants to interview these students. We'll do that with parent permission. We try to do it outside the school day. If we can't arrange for it to occur outside the school day, we will pull those students to a very public, accessible area, say near the library or near the main office where that interview will take place, so they're really not in the building while school's in session.
But I think your point about disruption is critical.
Right.
We don't want our classes. I know even when we're going to observe, even when we go to observe, sometimes I feel like, gosh, the fact that I'm gone in the classroom creates a different dynamic. So we're
I think, I think it's important to note that historically, and I think we've had a strong and positive working relationship with the media representatives in this regard. There may have been some exceptions, but to a large extent, when members of the media try to access the schools during the school day and we talk to them about these issues, they're responsive.
Right. The hardest times are when you've had a tragedy, you've had some major serious
crisis type
of
controversial,
and that's when we've had to sometimes say, please, we'll have a we'll have a press conference down at town hall just to get them off, because it can be really disruptive.
Following that privacy and safety perspective, then take it outside to public events where maybe we've got a top musician or top student athlete. I'd like to see something in here that says if it's in a school-controlled environment, that student isn't going to be contacted by the media without parental involvement, unless, of course, the kid's over 18. And I didn't. Maybe it's in here, but I didn't see it.
Well, I'd certainly bullet number 1 is the first step, which is that the media representative is obligated to report to the administration to gain that access.
Bullet 7.
And then bullet 7 is the secondary step, where as administrators, we're not going to allow that unless there's parent permission. Again, we have to be a little bit careful about the relative. If it's a football game, it's a different type of access point than if it's a classroom.
True, but you can have a policy that in here states that we will make every effort to ensure that the media adheres to this, which is not pursue our student athletes relative to student activities without parental approval.
Well, let's just say there's a football game at the stadium and Channel 12 is there, and they choose to interview a fan, quote unquote, happens to be a high school sophomore. How do we control? I don't even know how we would theoretically control that.
Yeah, that one I'm not as worried about.
I don't know how we control any of it, to be honest.
Yeah, I don't either.
I mean, if there's a fire somewhere, or there's a catastrophe, God willing, and the media show up, I mean, that's maybe in a learning environment. I know where you're going, Bruce, but maybe in a you kind of couch it in a learning environment. That might work, but broad, I don't think it will, only because you can't predict it, and to Dick's point, you can't control it.
I see a difference between the camera in the stands talking to somebody in the stands versus the camera on the sidelines trying to get in the face of a student athlete.
Vis-a-vis the camera in the classroom. I think they're all very different.
It may be that we have to look at, in those aspects of our programs where the press are routinely present, i.e. athletics, and perhaps a significant, regularly occurring club or activity event that occurs every year. A policy adoption as such would require us, I think, to have some language in place that would be a disclaimer for example, members of an athletic team. My experience as a coach for 10 years here at Wilton High School was my players were routinely interviewed by the press after games, but the press had to go through me to get permission. And it may be that this policy will require us to share with parents prior to the season some type of permission form, maybe too strong a language, but I'd be more inclined to have the opt-out piece in place, that we would try to gain their passive consent to allow that kind of, kids want to get interviewed by the press after they score a touchdown. So, you want to have some, the policy adoption might require us to implement some passive type organizing principles around those aspects of
and that would work
access.
for what I'm looking for.
Right.
That would work.
Right.
In number 4, I think, if in the judgment of the administration, the presence of any photographer, broadcaster, or news journalist causes such disruption that disorderly conduct of the activity, it's really more than the activity. It's the activity and operation. In other words, it's
and
not
school
only focused
operations.
On, I think it needs to be broader than just the activity.
And/or school.
And/or school
Operations.
School operations. And the other thing is, I think we do need to be respectful of 18-year-olds have rights that 17-year-olds don't. And I don't know, even the opt-out, I'm not quite sure how that works with an 18-year-old. I don't know what the law is.
Well, our practice is that the students are under our roof, and we try to maintain our practice of having parent permission be in place. It'd be interesting to review the case law of an 18-year-old who challenged that. I imagine that's probably
I have one that would have.
It actually happens quite a bit.
Glad they graduated.
I've been quite well, I've actually used that. Do you want to graduate?
You would have said not necessary.
But an 18-year-old does have rights that a 17-year-old doesn't. That's for sure.
I just think we ought to check with our attorneys as to.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions?
Well, I'm glad I got the red line, because I don't know if you guys read it. Apparently, the last paragraph says that the Board of Education shall establish an editorial policy committee to oversee the operation and contents of the district newsletter and annually appoint one member to this committee. In the 4 years that I've been on this board, we've been talking about a district newsletter of some sort, and I guess it's getting crossed off now. In addition, the membership of the committee shall also include the superintendent or his designee, like his chairman, one representative for the PTA and the Wilton Education Association. District newsletter shall publicize such areas of school life as regular instructional activities, curriculum, special events, unusual interests, co-curricular programs, and notable accomplishments. I think we put this back in wherever you want it. I don't think anybody ever disagreed that we should have a newsletter, and it fits very well, and I think the first policy, community relations. Maybe not be so formal about having a committee.
I think that in the policy 1000, that is only one of the
One of
mechanisms
many.
that we will communicate with the community by.
Well, it may
I
be
would
that.
need
I'm sorry.
to limit it to a district newsletter.
It may be that. You're referencing policy.
It wouldn't be limited. All I'm saying is that if we had a policy, which I guess we never adhered to, which is the argument maybe to pull it out, which is fine. But you're instituting a new policy. You're creating. You're striking one, and I think what's in here is actually pretty good, and it's trying to achieve your objective.
Well, the spirit of the comment may be that we need to revisit the second paragraph in 1110 to include that, because it isn't referenced directly right now. And it has become, we're really working on that as becoming a norm to make sure that there are newsletters coming out at the district level.
It's something we've talked
So
about.
I don't know if that's something that would make sense.
I think that's exactly where it belongs. Something to the effect of school and district newsletters, which are, again, one means of communication.
And it aligns with the strategic plan, too.
Yep.
Okay, well, we'll bring it back to review and discuss, and we'll keep it
Well,
on review and
I was
discuss.
just looking at the title to 1110. It says distribution of printed materials.
Shall be terminated.
I mean, that's going against the direction that we're trying to move in.
How about distribution of communication materials?
Communication materials.
I mean, they're
Communications.
You can think about it.
Information.
I mean, they are printed in that they appear.
But information is the word. It doesn't matter
It's just-
if
it's a term
printer
that's-
or electronic.
Right.
Yeah.
Historically, it's the practice of boards of education to use that term to describe this. It's becoming outdated as time marches on.
We're so not historic, we're hysteric.
Printed in.
Okay, thank you very much.
I spent a lot of time with
It's
the
a lot
board,
of work.
and I'm quite pleased I don't have to join you for the next agenda item.
Oh, that's too bad.
Stay where you are. Tim does a lot of good work that went into this thing.
Thank you, Jim.
Do we want to move the next one to the new board as well? So they can weigh in?
I don't think so. Okay, we're moving on to the action items and the school calendar adjustment and the revision of the revision.
Before we begin to discuss how we might modify the calendar for this year, I wanted just to take a very quick moment to thank some people for their work during the difficult days that followed the October 29th snow/blizzard. First off, our first selectman, I think, was very helpful and very engaged, and we spent time. I spoke to him almost on a daily basis, sometimes multiple times, about the efforts that we're undergoing and where we were with our school recoveries and so on. So I appreciate the work he did on that. It's a very difficult time, and people were very frustrated. Many of us who were without power for the entire week, and I think it was a lot to attend to during that time. Also, like to thank the police chief and the police department and the fire department, fire chief, the EMT paramedics, social service people who helped with the shelter at Miller Driscoll, Tom Thurkettle and the Wilton Public Works people, and our people, Sean O'Toole and the maintenance staff, and our transportation coordinator, Mary Channing, who spent a lot of time surveying the community. We were trying to verify or find out which roads were going to be passable. As you know, we had until very late in the week, we had numbers of roads that had wires hanging down, would not permit a bus, and she was constantly working to make sure that we were up to date on where we were with that situation. The decisions to close the school during the week were made in close consultation with the town, and were based, as I said, on our ability to restore power. We had half of our schools without power for well into Wednesday, almost all of Wednesday. And what I think a lot of people don't recognize is that when the power goes back up in a school, there's a lot of work that goes on to getting the school back online. A lot of the mechanical systems need to be reprogrammed, the air handling systems, other heating systems, so on. So it was a great deal of work trying to get Middlebrook and Cider Mill back online. On September 22nd, as you may recall, the board modified the 11-12 calendar in response to the 5 days we lost because of Irene. Now that we've lost an additional 5 days, we're here tonight to revisit this matter. I just want to share some information the public may not be aware of, and some of it they are well aware of, that there's a legally mandated a minimum number of school days. It's 180 days. And provisions of state law provide some very clear language about days which may not be used as school days. I think that's where some people don't understand some of the rulings. The state has prohibited allowing students to go to school on Saturdays or Sundays, and for obvious reasons, I think that one. But it does take away a little flexibility that you might have if you weren't operating in a public setting. We cannot make up time by going longer hours. So it's not like we can just add a few hours a week and make up the 5 days that we lost. We are prohibited from using holidays in December or January for school days. For example, Martin Luther King Day, we're specifically prohibited by law from using that day. And we cannot go to school after June 30th. In any given year. A second piece of information I wanted to share, because I've been asked this question, and that is, what about the possibility of a waiver? There was a wonderful, just as there was during post-Irene period student theory that because this was an act of God or an act of nature, that somehow we would be absolved of and we would not have to make up the days. It was fanciful thinking. And I think that we have, however, as fanciful as it was, I thought it was worth approaching the state. The only precedents we're aware of occurred in 1973 after the great ice storm that closed down the entire state for the better part of a week. Some of you lived through that. And a second one, Tom Mooney advised me, was given to Greenwich, one school in Greenwich, because of the closure due to mold. You may remember the school that had the horrible mold outbreak. I spoke to the executive director of our superintendent's group and asked him about the new commissioner. We have a new state ed commissioner, new members on the state board, if there was any possibility that a waiver might be considered. And he told me that CAPS has urged the commissioner to collect some data from each district on the following questions. How many days have you lost due to weather-related cancellations? And again, as you know, we've lost 10. Some districts are at 12. I don't know if they were able to get back in today, but at least 12 days. Some state, West Hartford, I believe, and Farmington and Avon were hit very hard. What's your district's 3-year average number of weather-related closures? How many remaining vacation days do you have? That's a key provision. What is your current schedule last day of school? Have you moved professional days to late June? So because we still have vacation days remaining, plus the last week of June, at this point, we feel it would be highly unlikely that would qualify for a waiver. This is unprecedented territory for the state, I think, but I think it's also clear that if there were to be a waiver, it would not be issued until after April 1st. So I think what they would grant a waiver if you ran out of days, and then you still weren't going to be able to hit after using all of your vacation time, you would not hit the 180-day minimum, and then they would consider it. But it's really not likely to happen. Given given the decision we made following Irene, we've now lost the plan that the board had approved in September. We now would have 2 days under that plan. We've lost 2 days of the April break. So what that does is that we begin then to look at what are the days available to us as we look at modifying the calendar. And there are 2 professional development days, January 17th, February 17th. There's February break, 4 days, 5 days if you use February 17th as an instructional day rather than professional development. We would have 3 days under our current revised plan of April break, and then 5 days from June 25th through 29th. As we talked about in September, I think the key unknown is the severity of the coming winter. And again, I harken back to my optimistic comments about, 3 days is ample time, number of days, given our historic trends. I would ask us to remind us that over the last few months we've had an earthquake, major tropical storm, plague, locusts, and a blizzard in October. So having that, I did seek out, for what it's worth, some information about long-range forecasting, and this is, every year people like to torment me and say, I read in the Farmer's Almanac that you're toast, A meteorologist, Paul Yeager, who's the author of a book, Weather-Wise, Facts, Myths, and Oddities, says, the Farmer's Almanac says, get ready for a wet, wild winter in 2012. Highlights include, I don't know why they use highlights. The other guys get entirely too excited about it.
Before you depress us, can I make a motion to come out of
I second that. Let's go to vote, guys.
That's right.
I think we're all agreeing that
we have to hear that.
Indulge me. Very stormy and wet. Anyway. But I could give you hours more, but I sense that that's probably not in the best interest.
I have a question before we move on. You stated that we cannot use holidays in December or January for school days. What about holidays in February and April? We have two holidays, one being President's Day in February, the other being Good Friday, which is April 6th. Are those available to us?
I believe you could use President's Day according to our legal counsel. I think and you could use Good Friday. I think
They're both not national holidays.
But I think the Good Friday piece.
They're state holidays.
The Good Friday piece
they
would
are.
be, I think, pretty.
President's Day is
a national holiday. And if you
Good Friday
hold
is a
school
state
on a
holiday.
national holiday, you have to have curriculum and a program.
We would have to
around
do.
the holiday.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ellen. What we'd have to do is similar to what we talked about with the Veterans Day, some programming in the school where you use Veterans Day or President's Day. I would not recommend the Good Friday for a lot of reasons. So I think we looked through some options. One was to take future snow days from the February break. Option 2 was to kind of stay the course with what we had proposed with the April break, and then if necessary go into late June. And the third option was kind of an alternating option, taking days between February and April. So that the recommendation we had given for your consideration, as was said earlier, was option 2, which we felt was more consistent. The people had shifted plans based on the action we took in September, and I know some of you are in that situation. So that's why we thought of the option 2, which would be to move the January and February professional development days to late June, which would restore the 2 days that we've taken from the April break. The last day of school is the 22nd. And then with each additional cancellation, as we talked about before, we would take 1 day from the April break, beginning the 16th, 17th, 18th, and so on. If we used all 5 of the April break days, additional days would take us into the week of June 25th.
Somewhat humorous question, but what happens if we have to take days out of that April vacation? We hold school and nobody shows up.
Well, that's a very legitimate question, and I've lived it. I did that in another district back in the winter of '94. But it was a time when we had my first year in Connecticut after leaving Southern California, where I used to call my Eastern friends and torment them about the weather. I don't do that anymore. And we had 17 major storms, and we did this April break. What would happen, and again, whether it would happen here, the elementary parents waved to us on their way to the airport. About half of the middle school kids showed up, and because of athletics in April, you're well aware, about 60%. So you see as you go up in the system for a lot of reasons, your attendance improves in those weeks. The one scary point about that is if we do lose all the April, it's a 4-month sled from, or it's a bad choice of words. It's a 4-month run to the end from February, and it's
the only positive to that though would be that we do have a long weekend because of Good Friday.
Right.
So
and another one for Memorial Day.
And Memorial Day.
So it's terrible, but it's not terrible.
Yeah.
And again, graduation is the 30th.
Humor. I'm not finding a lot of humor in any of this.
Would we consider changing graduation to 1 or 2 days after the last day of school, rather than the 30th? Because the 30th, for all intents and purposes, is the beginning of the 4th of July holiday. Even though 4th of July happens to be on a Wednesday, but it is.
Also, we might not have to use. We could, in theory, still have it be the 23rd.
That's correct.
Correct?
We could.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Well, no, because you'd be using we have 5 days to use before we would have to move it from the 23rd.
Right.
So I'm not sure we need to set graduation.
I don't think
we have a policy.
We don't do that until April 1st.
Right. I don't even think we need to address that.
Tim had been shaking his head. The graduation, one of the difficult, and it is a consideration, not the only consideration. I think the whole PGP
I've heard that.
preparation, those of you who haven't, many of you have been involved, including myself, is that that's a pretty major logistical shift, and to get, usually Julia there are a few days between when the kids leave and when they begin to start ramping up for the Saturday night.
And I understand they do have to book DJs and rent equipment and so forth for that.
Yeah.
How late is that trigger date, do we know?
For PGP?
Well, they're already starting to organize.
Well, historically, we don't set graduation until April 1st.
Right, I don't
So
The PGP date's a moving target.
It's a moving target until April 1st, no matter what happens.
Right, so why address it tonight?
Right, we don't need to.
And we'll have a better perspective.
Well, we just did
February
that as
when
a
we
frame
have
of reference for when, not to say that it was set in stone.
I don't think we want to give the impression, though, that it's definitely
That
the
it's-
30th.
Right.
Okay.
I think, because this does, the way it's written, it does.
Okay.
Yeah, it sets it.
Right.
So let's
Commencement
amend Bruce's
TBD.
motion to eliminate the last bullet point. And I second that amendment.
So we have a
We have a motion on the floor.
motion to approve?
Motion to
Any
approve.
discussion?
Motion to amend.
Motion to amend.
And then approve?
Yeah, you have to approve the amendment.
I'll have a second on that.
I second both.
Okay. We're voting on the amendment. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, and now we'll vote on the motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Option 2 passes,
All right.
As amended.
as amended. Okay, so now we'll look at the...
We're not done yet?
And I think at this point I've gone through the timeline prior to this, and I think we all know what's happening, although the next meeting is on Tuesday, the 22nd. We'll say right now at 7 o'clock. I'm not sure if we'll have an executive session then, but right now it's at 7, no executive session.
Can I ask a question that is somewhat related to the timeline? And
Yes.
that is, when do we expect receipt of the NESC study on our support staff? Will we have that before we look at the first draft of the budget?
Believe so. Will the board have the draft of the NESC report before the first draft of the budget?
Oh, I believe so.
Yeah, that was what we've been working for.
Okay.
Karen, you trumped me on that. I was going to have that be my last question.
As a board member?
No.
I have to think up another one.
Pardon?
The timeline shows public hearing on the 19th, and the last one we held on the 15th. And I will...
Of January.
Yes,
So-
I'm sorry, January.
So that's 18.
So it's the 18th now.
Okay, of
Or
January.
you send something?
Which
you
is
send
a
something-
Wednesday instead of a Thursday, right?
Yeah, I'll let you know
Yes.
the timeline. I didn't have my computer to...
Okay, got it. Any other points? Okay, at this point, we allow comments from the public. And seeing no comments from the public, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second? All in favor? Aye. Meeting adjourned. Hamlet.
What?
Hamlet.
Hamlet?
I think that's where we're going.
The last